So, Domnica Radulescu, please tell us a bit about the book you will be discussing today. So, could you tell us, could you give us a brief description of both the subject matter and the inspiration for the book?
Sure. So, my book, my most recent novel, Country of Red Azaleas, is a book about surviving trauma through friendship and love and creativity. It traces the story, the journey of two women who were born, grew up, and lived in the former Yugoslavia. One is Serbian and one is Bosnian. And the beginning of the start of the Bosnian War of the 90s separates them. They have parallel destinies, but they keep in touch. And at some point, they meet again. They are tied to each other for life, and their journey has many meandering paths.
You are a creative writer, but you are also a very accomplished academic, so I like to analyze the hybridity of your writing in my own studies of your work. So now to your creative process. Could you please describe your process in researching and writing this book? I know this is your second novel with a bibliography.
Yes, it's true. My creative processes and the writing processes of my fiction works are very multi-layered, in the sense that they involve very life research, that is going to the places where my characters live and act, immersing myself into their lives, into the spaces, into their atmosphere, as well as gathering personal stories of, in this case, stories of survival, of survivors of this terrible war of the 90s in the Balkans. And of course, it does involve many forms of research, of archival research, of reading in as many areas that are connected to the subject matter. For instance, I have studied and read many testimonials of war and of survivors, not just from the Bosnian War, but also from various other genocidal events, and other works of fiction that are connected, other academic works. In other words, I try to expand my vision of the subject and to stuff my intellect with as many images and as much information as possible.
So how did writing this book challenge you?
Yes, this book was more difficult to write than my previous two novels. For one thing, it concerns and it is inspired by events in an area of the world that, although neighboring that of my native country of Romania, was not an area that I knew very well personally. I have not myself lived through that war, but however, I was greatly touched to follow the stories of people who survived, of people who have gone through and lived through the siege of Sarajevo, who went through the many trials and horrors of that period. I was inspired to it. I was haunted by many of the realities of that war, and therefore I followed them through and through, and that way it became harder emotionally. Yes, it was quite an emotional challenge, because it took me to realms outside of myself. It took me to very dark places, but it was also very emboldening. It was a very extraordinary experience to undertake this journey.
So did the process of writing this book differ from that of previous works?
Well, yes and no. It was similar in that it followed my my pattern of total immersion into the spaces, the colors, the rhythms, the cultural, psychological, and geographical landscapes of the various characters that I create. And that I followed. I went and traveled to all these places, to Sarajevo, to Belgrade, to Srebrenica, visited the concentration camps, the former concentration camps in Srebrenica, talked to survivors, talked to people, gathered personal stories. So that way it differed in terms, as I already said, in terms of the spaces and the realms that I have journeyed through. And it differed in that it took me significantly outside of myself. So it was a journey both inside myself and outside of myself. And it was a very transformative and very challenging experience.
Has your writing changed over time?
Sure, yes, sure, absolutely. It has changed. As a writer, I hope so. I hope that I keep evolving, that I keep developing as a writer in a multiplicity of directions. I try to keep experimenting with voice, with narrative time, with the creation of characters, with the construction of the plot. So I would say, for instance, my first two novels, Train to Trieste and Black Sea Twilight, they followed, they were coming-of-age stories of Romanian heroines and followed their journeys as well. I'd like to point out that all of my novels are journeys of empowered female characters who tell their own stories, who take ownership of their lives, of their destinies, and who tell their stories in their own voices. So in that way, there is a continuum throughout my work. My recent novel, Country of Red Azaleas, however, is more the story of mature adult women who go through the hardships of survival, of motherhood, of the difficulties of the couple, and of this very traumatic experiences of war and displacement. And in that way, I have tried to experiment more with the creation of the characters and to evolve as a writer in a more diverse direction.
Because my perception as a critic of your work is that the characters are livelier and livelier as we go along. So I was wondering, at which point in your novel writing does your experience as a playwright kick in and influence the making of the characters? Because I think in Country of Red Azaleas there's a lot of performance in how the characters evolve and live. So they are very, very lively. We see them as if on stage.
Yes, it's true. My experience as a theater director, as a performer myself, and as a playwright feeds into my fiction writing and my narratives, and the two are very synergistic and merge with one another. So yes, I have a almost filmic imagination when I create my scenes and my characters, and I also hear the respective voices. I often start a chapter or the novel that I'm writing from a line of dialogue, from the voice with the voice. The voice is very crucial, is very important to me. And if I may refer to that, my first novel, Train to Trieste, was actually, its great attraction for my first publisher, Knopf, was precisely the voice, what they consider to be a very new, striking, original voice. So that comes largely from my experience with theater, the multidimensionality of theater. Theater is an art that exists in time and space, in real time and space, and that is an art of the body, of the voice. Therefore, I naturally am driven to create my characters and the situations in which they act in a dramatic, theatrical, lively way.
Is there a pattern in your creative process?
Well, yes and no. With each new novel I develop new ways of going about the creation of the novel. But I would say that, yes, I could trace some kind of a pattern in that go about following my characters to the places where I imagine them. I travel to those places. I live with them for periods of time, and I could say my writing is, during the times in which I write my novels, is a sort of omnipresent with me. I write when I walk, when I swim, and does not just consist in the actual action of sitting at a desk or at a laptop and writing. So that way, that is my way of creating and of writing, so to speak. Writing as I live and writing as I actually write. And the other continuum, the other thread that follows through my creative processes from book to book is that I go through periods where I just absorb experience. I talk to people, I live, I smell the smells, I absorb the lights, the sounds, I listen to people talk, I gather stories, and then there is a very intense period, which is the actual period of writing. And for instance, with this last novel, for quite a while, I could say I lived with these two heroines. They were part of my life on an almost daily basis. They haunted me, they followed me everywhere, they became my friends.
Because they're so much alive, aren't they? So I can imagine that being
yes, and I followed them and their journeys. After a while, they acquired their own life, and I went wherever they took me.
What about reading? What role does reading play in your writing? I was wondering about analog research, books, bookstores, libraries. Do they play a role in your research for your books?
Everything plays a role in my creative processes. I'm very permeable and very porous, so I'm sort of like the sponge of the world. And then my creative imagination sort of sieves through that, filters through it, and comes back out with images, plots, characters. So yes, reading plays a crucial event. I have been for my entire adult life a student, a critic, a teacher of literature, and I think as any serious writer and artist, creative artist, needs to keep up with what goes on in their field of work, and to know what's out there and what your fellow writers, creative artists are doing, and to not write and create in a vacuum. So yes, everything plays a role, and I do spend time reading, a lot of time while I'm writing, reading other books, other works of fiction or nonfiction, creative nonfiction, and scholarly books.
So do you find your voice is influenced by what you yourself read? And how do you distill your voice from those authors that might be influencing you or that you enjoy reading?
Yes, of course I'm influenced. I think it's foolish and dishonest for any creative writer and artist to say that they are appearing like a mushroom out of nowhere. Yes, I have gathered a lot of literary influences throughout my life as a critic, as a teacher, as an educator, and of course as a writer. I don't remember a time when I wasn't reading literature and when I wasn't reading. And also I have always been writing as long as I remember. So could you name 3 books that you think everybody should read, and maybe tell us a few words about your very favorite book, if there is one? Yeah, that's a very hard thing to ask me, particularly because my brains are bursting at the seams with so many books that I love and that I teach and that I admire. I want to say also, with regards to the previous question, I have many role models, but about I will go a little bit backwards to the previous question about how do I distill my voice. I really never worry about that. I don't have a problem with distilling my own voice from that of from the voices of other authors, because my voice comes from a very deep place inside myself that I always can recognize and know very well. So it's my creative imagination filters, it absorbs and then filters the other voices, and then somehow my own creative voice emerges with its own original tonalities, I believe, I'd like to think. And going now to this next question about my favorite 3 books, well, in a very painful almost attempt to try to gather my 3 most favorite books, I would think those that, let's say, I would take with me on that proverbial deserted island would be the book by Marguerite Duras. She is truly one of my great role models, writers, my heroine, my writer-heroine. And her novel L'Amant, or The Lover, it's a perfect book. And she is an extraordinary writer. The way she creates her characters, the intensity and beauty and lyricism and economy of her style, just I could get drunk on it. And the other 2, one book that I could say I draw a lot of my own personal philosophy of living from is Voltaire's Candide. It's a book for all times and for all situations. Again, it's a classic, and not just because it's a classic, but because in this little beautifully conceived, ironic, at times comical, tragic book, you have the story of humanity, the human condition, the madness of history, and it is always relevant and pertinent. And then another book that has played a very important part in my, not just in my creative voice and in my creative writing, that has exerted some influence on me, but also a book that I always like to go back to, is Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar. It is just a gem of feminist writing and of sharp, edgy, no nonsense, taking no prisoners kind of writing. So I would stick with these 3 for now, on top of the many scores of others that I have in mind, but it's good enough for now.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sabina.